The day my inheritance became a reality, a man in a polo shirt embroidered with a community logo informed me I was trespassing on it. Beyond his uniformed stance, a sprawling development of several hundred homes unfolded. Immaculate lawns, gleaming roofs, and silent streets, all resting on the bedrock of my family's legacy. They had decided my birthright was merely symbolic. A judge, much later, would use a different word, squatting. For a long moment, I remained motionless, the keys to my truck still clutched in my hand, dust from the unpaved shoulder settling around me. I was trying to reconcile how a formal document from a legal office had somehow morphed into this confrontation. A security gate, a crisp uniform, and a stranger asserting that I had no right to be on land my family had held since before he was born. The guard himself wasn't aggressive, a fact that paradoxically made the situation feel worse. His tone was measured, professional, as if this was a well-rehearsed script he had performed countless times. "Sir, unless you are a resident of this community, I'm going to have to ask you to reverse your vehicle." My gaze drifted past him, through the bars of the gate, beyond the meticulously sculpted hedges and the rows of identical, upscale mailboxes. I could see street signs bearing pleasant, fabricated names, children's playgrounds, and the soft glow of porch lights that had yet to be turned off in the morning sun. An entire neighborhood was stirring to life, completely oblivious to the fact that the very earth beneath their foundations did not belong to the entity that had sold it to them. I stated my name. It elicited no recognition. I explained that I was there to view the land I had just formally inherited. It was then that his expression shifted, not to alarm, not to defiance, but to something that felt unsettlingly like pity. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice softening, "but this land was developed years ago." That was the instant a profound understanding clicked into place. This was not a simple misunderstanding. This was a system, and I had just driven straight into its operational center. I never grew up with the expectation of an inheritance. In my family, land wasn't discussed in the same breath as stocks or bank accounts. It was a constant, a quiet certainty in the background of life, something you implicitly trusted would endure even if everything else crumbled. The land had first belonged to my grandfather. He'd acquired it after returning from a war, a time when sprawling hills of dense forest and stubborn rock were considered undesirable. He had worked that land with his own two hands, gradually clearing sections for a small homestead, raising a family there, burying his wife under a lone oak tree, and intentionally leaving the vast majority of it wild. He often said, "Land doesn't ask much of a person, just a little respect and a lot of patience." When my parents passed away, I was still a minor, too young to legally inherit, too young to comprehend the complexities of probate courts, the purgatory of estate limbo, or the consequences of paperwork languishing in the wrong government filing cabinet for an extended period. The land didn't disappear. It simply entered a state of suspension. It was held by the state, which they claimed was for its management and protection, until I came of age and was in a position to claim it. Life, as it does, moved forward without it. I left my hometown, established a career, paid rent on apartments, bought my groceries, and lived the life of anyone who assumes the past is a closed chapter and the future is a problem for another day. The land transformed into a personal myth, a story I'd share occasionally, usually over second beer. My family used to own a big piece of land back home. I always used the past tense. It felt safer that way. Then, the letter arrived. It was unremarkable. No fancy letterhead, no urgent courier, just a standard business envelope from a law firm I'd never heard of. Inside, a formal notice stated that a long-dormant family estate had finally navigated its last administrative obstacle. The enclosed documents declare that I was now the sole legal heir to approximately 1,200 acres of rural land. I remember reading that figure, then reading it again, and a third time. 1,200 acres didn't sound like property. It sounded like a clerical error. I dialed the number printed at the bottom of the letterhead. The attorney who answered was professional, efficient, and audibly overburdened. He confirmed the details, gave a cursory explanation for the decades-long delay, and then, after a slight hesitation, uttered a phrase that would stick with me. "You should be aware, there might be occupants." He didn't elaborate, and, in my naivety, I didn't press him. At that moment, I pictured a forgotten hunting lease or perhaps an old caretaker's cottage. Nothing out of the ordinary. Land accumulates history. You expect to find some dust. I didn't rush back. I didn't start packing or making grand life-altering plans. I told myself I'd take a weekend drive, check on the condition of the property, maybe walk a portion of it to reconnect with a piece of my past that had been patiently waiting for me. That was the level of casualness with which I approached it. Because no one ever prepares you for the gut-wrenching discovery that your inheritance didn't just sit idle. It was exploited. It was developed. It was sold off, piece by piece, to hundreds of people who would never know your name. Standing at that gate, listening to a security guard recite community regulations as if they were ancient law, I finally grasped the lawyer's cryptic warning. Occupants wasn't a legal technicality. It was an understatement of epic proportions. And I was just beginning to realize how many people had been standing on my family's ground while I was away. They did not make me wait long. 2 days after my unceremonious turnaround at the gate, an email landed in my inbox from the Homeowners Association. It had a polite subject line and was written in neutral, corporate language, the kind of communication designed to project an aura of reasonableness and normalcy. They were inviting me to a clarifying conversation. The meeting was held at a house. I recognized the moment I saw it. Not because I had ever been inside, but because it was architecturally impossible to ignore. It occupied the highest point of the entire subdivision, a vantage point that offered an unobstructed view of the winding streets, the community playground, and even the man-made lake they had christened with a name that sounded natural, but was anything but. The house was larger than the others, newer, its landscaping more obsessively maintained. It was the kind of residence built to serve as a constant, silent reminder of who was in control. This was her house, the HOA president's. She met me at the door with the practiced charm of a seasoned politician. A firm, confident handshake, a flawless smile, and expensive sunglasses pushed high on her head, just enough to make her eye contact feel deliberate and assessing. Every aspect of her presence radiated control. We sat at a long, polished kitchen island. Sunlight streamed through oversized picture windows, and from my seat, I could see a sea of rooftops stretching out in every direction. An endless panorama of homes constructed on land my grandfather had once traversed without encountering a single fence. She wasted no time on pleasantries. She unfurled large, color-coded maps, detailed development plans, and presented thick binders filled with organized tabs and highlighted sections. Everything was impeccably arranged, official-looking, and exuded an air of unassailable legitimacy. According to her presentation, the land had been legally transferred decades prior. The subdivision, she explained, possessed all the necessary permits, titles, and insurance. The entire enterprise was wrapped in a protective sheath of reassuring legal language and embossed seals. Then she looked directly at me and delivered the line she had clearly prepared. "Your inheritance is symbolic." She said it not with harshness or cruelty, but with a casual dismissiveness, as if she were correcting a child who had fundamentally misunderstood a basic concept of how the world operates. She elaborated that while my family might have once held title to the land, the forces of progress had moved on. The community represented an investment of millions of dollars. Families resided here now. Schools, utilities, and roads had all been built under what she termed proper authority. What I possessed, she suggested, was a sentimental attachment, a family story, not a legitimate claim. I posed a single, simple question. "If that's the case," I asked, "why am I here talking to you?" Her smile returned, but it was tighter this time, a fraction less relaxed. That's when she presented her offer. They were prepared to buy me out. A generous sum, she assured me, especially given the circumstances. Alternatively, if I preferred, I could be granted an honorary, non-resident membership in the association. It would come with limited rights, of course, but it would allow everyone to move forward peacefully. She delivered this proposition as if she were bestowing upon me a great favor. I let my eyes wander around her expensive kitchen, taking in the high-end appliances, the commanding view, the sheer elevation of her position. In that moment, a chilling realization settled deep in my chest. She wasn't afraid of me. She was utterly confident. Confident that whatever legal documents I possessed were no match for the physical reality she had constructed. Confident that no court would dismantle an entire neighborhood for the sake of a single heir who had arrived late to the game. Confident that the system she knew so well rewarded momentum far more than it rewarded truth. I told her I wasn't interested. The atmosphere in the room subtly shifted. Her smile vanished completely, and her tone became perceptibly cooler. She gently reminded me that resisting reality could become a costly endeavor. She spoke of legal fees, protracted delays, and unforeseen complications. Her words were those of someone who had navigated this exact scenario before and knew precisely how it was destined to conclude. I stood up to leave. As I walked toward the door, I took one final look through those expansive windows. From that high perch, the land did indeed look settled, claimed, and finalized. But I knew differently. My grandfather had always said that the land remembers who cared for it first. As I drove away from her fortress on the hill, I understood something else with stark clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a few clarifying documents. This was a calculated power play, and the woman residing at the apex of my land had absolutely no intention of relinquishing it without a fight. The letters began to arrive the following week. Initially, there was nothing overtly aggressive about them. No explicit threats, no accusatory language, just heavy, official-looking envelopes. The kind of mail that instills a knot in your stomach before you've even broken the seal. The first notice was a masterpiece of passive aggression. It thanked me for my anticipated cooperation. That phrase alone should have served as a warning. It proceeded to explain that a comprehensive review of adjacent properties was currently underway and that my own inclusion status would soon be clarified. It is conveniently omitted by whom. A second letter appeared 3 days later. This one contained numbers. It was a bill for back dues. According to the HOA's meticulously kept records, I was in arrears for nearly 15 years' worth of assessments. These included fees for landscaping services, road maintenance, security patrols, and community amenities that I had not only never used, but had never even been granted access to. A neat, itemized list culminated in a substantial total at the bottom, accompanied by a polite reminder that interest was continuing to accrue daily. I read the letter twice, set it down on my table, and let out a short, hollow laugh. I hadn't signed a single document. I hadn't joined any association. I had been physically barred from even setting foot past the main gate. The third letter shed its polite veneer. It cited a litany of violations: non-compliant fencing, the presence of unauthorized structures, and a failure to submit exterior plans for architectural approval. It was, in its own absurd way, quite impressive how many rules I had managed to break without ever being a member of their community. Near the bottom of the page, printed in a smaller font, was a sentence that transformed the entire tone of their campaign. Failure to comply may result in enforcement procedures. Enforcement, not a conversation, not mediation. Enforcement. I was beginning to grasp the nature of my opponent. This wasn't a simple neighborhood disagreement. This was a war waged on paper. It was a strategy that didn't involve breaking windows or throwing punches. It was designed to slowly and methodically bury you under an avalanche of administrative notices until you were either too exhausted or too financially depleted to continue standing your ground. I tried calling the number listed on the letterhead. I was transferred twice before I reached a woman who identified herself as a compliance coordinator. Her voice was serene, rehearsed, and utterly devoid of any interest in my side of the story. Our records indicate inclusion, she stated flatly. Inclusion in what? I demanded. The community, she replied, as if it were the only one in existence. I challenged her to produce a single document bearing my signature. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "That will be reviewed as part of the enforcement process." That was the moment I stopped making phone calls. Instead, I began to collect. Every letter was placed into a folder, which soon became a binder, which then necessitated a second binder. I scanned every document, saved every envelope, and meticulously logged the dates and times of their arrival. I printed out emails and stapled them together like exhibits, because that is precisely what they were becoming. The language in their notices grew progressively colder, more legalistic, and less human. They invoked phrases like aesthetic impact and community integrity, as if these abstract concepts justified reaching across a property line to unilaterally rewrite ownership through sheer repetition. One letter had the audacity to thank me for my continued non-response. Another informed me that my silence could be interpreted as consent. That particular one made me sit down. I realized then that their objective wasn't to convince me. It was to build a record. They were constructing a paper trail that would demonstrate to any future observer that I had been duly notified, repeatedly warned, and offered numerous opportunities to comply. A trail that would appear eminently reasonable to someone casually skimming a file months or years down the line. They weren't trying to win an argument. They were trying to outlast me. I drove out to the edge of the property one afternoon and just stood there looking at the familiar trees, the remnants of old fence lines, and the stone markers my grandfather had placed decades ago. None of that history mattered to the stack of paper piling up on my desk. The system didn't care about memory or intent. It cared about documentation, and they were generating a formidable amount of it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the contents of my binders spread out before me, and another realization dawned. This was no longer a question of whether I was right. It was a question of whether I was prepared. Because the moment an organization begins threatening enforcement on land you legally own, they're no longer asking for your permission. They're testing the limits of your resolve. And I could feel the pressure mounting, quiet, steady, and relentless, like a hand slowly tightening around a throat, waiting to see if you would struggle or simply give in. The paperwork assault was merely the initial volley. A week after the third notice arrived, I drove back out to the edge of the property, this time with a printed copy of my original survey map on the passenger seat. My intention wasn't to confront anyone. I just wanted to walk the boundary line my grandfather had established all those years ago. It was a line marked by old stones and shallow cuts in tree bark, the kind of demarcation that doesn't appear on glossy, modern maps, but possesses a permanence that time cannot easily erase. That's when I saw them, bright orange stakes, freshly driven into the earth where they had never been before. I followed their trail for several hundred yards and came across a small crew of men wearing safety vests, with high-tech GPS units clipped to their belts. They were calm, focused, and professional. They weren't sneaking or hiding. They were measuring my land as if it were already a foregone conclusion that it belonged to them. I asked who had authorized the new survey. One of the men glanced at a clipboard and replied, "The association." I informed them they were on private property. They didn't argue. One of them simply picked up his phone and made a call. 10 minutes later, 2 sheriff's department cruisers rolled up the access road. The officers emerged from their vehicles slowly, their hands relaxed, their expressions radiating a profound sense of boredom. I explained the situation. I showed them my documents. I pointed out where their new markers had been placed in direct conflict with the original boundary. They listened, they nodded, and then one of them spoke the words I had been dreading. "This is a civil matter, sir." I had heard that phrase before. Everyone has. It's the standard refrain of authority when it wants to avoid taking a side. As the officers were turning to leave, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. The HOA president had arrived. She hadn't come to argue or shout. She stood near her luxury SUV, sunglasses on, arms crossed, observing the entire scene with the detached air of someone watching a predictable outcome. One of the officers caught her eye. He gave a small lift of his hand in greeting. She smiled and waved back, addressing him by name. That was it. That was the moment of crystallization. It wasn't the survey stakes, it wasn't the letters, and it wasn't even the fabricated fines. It was that casual, familiar exchange that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a well-oiled machine, and it knew exactly how to operate without generating friction for itself. The officers departed. The surveyors resumed their work. and I was left standing there, holding a sheaf of papers that suddenly felt insignificant in my hands. That evening, I went home and unearthed my grandfather's old maps, hand-drawn on yellowed paper, precise in a way that modern digital prints could never be. I laid them out next to the HOA's glossy diagrams and saw the problem immediately. Their boundaries crept, just a little at a time, a few feet here, a straightened curve there, nothing dramatic enough to catch a casual eye, but enough to effectively change the legal description on paper. It was a strategy of claiming ground by inches through repetition. I drove the perimeter of the property again that afternoon, slowly and methodically. I discovered 3 more of their new markers that hadn't been there the day before. That night, sleep eluded me. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the binders, at the letters, at the conflicting surveys. I realized that if I continued to treat this situation as a misunderstanding, I was going to lose everything without ever setting foot inside a courtroom. So, I stopped playing defense. The next morning, I made 2 critical phone calls. The first was to a land use attorney who specialized in complex boundary disputes, a man who had dedicated his career to untangling claims older than most of the buildings in the state. He listened to my story in quiet concentration and then simply asked me to send him everything. The second call was to a forensic land surveyor, not a large firm that designed subdivisions, but an independent expert who worked with archaic records, original plats, and historical markers. Someone who operated on the principle that land doesn't lie. People do. When I hung up the phone, I felt a palpable shift inside me. I was still outnumbered, still encircled by a sea of houses, roads, and an authority that feigned blindness to my existence. But for the first time since that security gate had closed in front of me, I was no longer just reacting. I was preparing. Because once boundaries start to move and the local police start waving at the very people pushing them, you're no longer dealing with a neighborly dispute. You're dealing with a quiet takeover. And quiet takeovers only succeed when the person standing in the way chooses to remain quiet too. The ugliness did not erupt all at once. It began with small things, the kind of incidents you could almost explain away if you were determined to believe in the better nature of people. One morning, as I drove down the dirt access road that wound through the trees toward the rear of the property, I heard a sound that didn't belong. A sharp pop, followed by another. The truck shuddered. When I got out to inspect the tires, I found 3 roofing nails lying in the tracks, spaced just far enough apart to inflict damage without appearing overtly deliberate. I picked them up and held their clean, new way in my palm. Someone had placed them there. A few days later, I discovered trash dumped near the fence line. Broken shipping pallets, scraps of drywall, and greasy fast food bags. It wasn't enough to warrant a call to the county, but it was just enough to send a clear message. When I cleared it away, a fresh pile appeared a week later, this time closer to the main gate. My "No Trespassing" sign vanished overnight. When I found it, it was bent in half and tossed into the underbrush like a piece of casual litter. None of it was dramatic. And that was the entire point. Each act existed in a gray area, hovering between coincidence and intent. It was a campaign of petty pressure designed to wear you down, precisely because it never quite crossed a line you could definitively point to. Then, the pressure started to become personal. My wife noticed a dark sedan idling near the end of our driveway when she left for work in the morning. The same car appeared twice more that week. It was never close enough to confront, but never far enough away to be ignored. When she pulled out, it would roll forward slowly. When she stopped, it would stop too. She told me about it that night. Her voice strained as she tried to sound casual. I could hear the fear beneath her words. A few days after that, my son came home from school unusually quiet. Over dinner, he asked me why a kid at school had said we might have to move soon. When I pressed him on who had said it, he shrugged. A teacher heard it from a parent, he mumbled. They said you were in trouble. That was the moment the air in the room fundamentally changed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my hand on the table. I just sat there, looking at my family, and felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest. This was no longer about administrative fees. It wasn't about paperwork or survey lines or polite threats veiled in legal jargon. This was intimidation. I installed cameras the next day, motion-activated, with cloud-based storage. One was positioned on the gate, another near our driveway, and a third covering the tree line. I didn't tell anyone outside of my immediate family. I didn't post warning signs. I just watched. It didn't take long. Late one night, the alerts pinged on my phone. Slow movement detected near the fence, just inside the woods. I pulled up the live feed and saw two men wearing jackets with the HOA logo, walking the boundary line with powerful flashlights. They stopped periodically to point, to gesture, and to speak quietly to each other, as if they were planning something. They weren't lost. They weren't checking on utilities. They were conducting an inspection. I called the sheriff's office the following morning. I detailed the nails, the illegal dumping, the car following my wife, and the camera footage. The deputy's response was sympathetic but ultimately hollow. "Sounds like a civil matter, sir," he said. "It's hard to prove intent." I hung up and sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall. What struck me wasn't anger. It was a chilling clarity. Every step they had taken so far was calculated to make me doubt myself, to exhaust my resolve, to make me choose the path of least resistance. Sell, sign, or comply. But the moment they brought my family into their campaign of pressure, the entire equation was irrevocably altered. There are certain things a man can tolerate when they are aimed solely at him. This was not one of them. That afternoon, I walked the property again, this time more slowly. I took photographs of the old stone markers, of the trees my grandfather had blazed by hand, of the exact spots where their new survey stakes now stood. I wasn't just wandering anymore. I was documenting. That evening, I sat my family down and told them the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I explained that there was a dispute over the land, that it might become uncomfortable, but that none of it was their fault. My wife reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Do what you have to do," she said. That was all the permission I needed. The next morning, I made 3 more calls. One was to the forensic land surveyor, confirming the scope of his work and authorizing him to dig deeper into county archives, original plats, anything that predated the development. The second was to my attorney, instructing him to prepare for litigation, not negotiation. And the third was to a private investigator, someone accustomed to working quietly, following patterns, and uncovering connections that were designed to remain hidden. When I hung up the final call, I felt the immense pressure on my chest ease, just a fraction. Not because the situation had improved, but because I had stopped pretending it would resolve itself. That night, as I checked the camera feeds one last time before bed, I said the words aloud, just to hear their weight in the quiet room. This stops now. Because when an organization starts scattering nails on your road, whispering to your children at school, and circling your home after dark, you're no longer dealing with bureaucracy. You're dealing with people who believe they can take whatever they want without consequence. And I was finished letting them believe that. The truth did not reveal itself in a single dramatic moment. It emerged in fragments, old pieces of a puzzle that had been sitting quietly in dusty boxes and forgotten filing cabinets, while newer, louder paperwork attempted to bury them forever. The forensic surveyor was the first to call back. He didn't sound excited. He sounded cautious, like a man who had learned from experience that when something doesn't add up, you don't rush to announce it. "I need a few more days," he said, "but there's something here." In the meantime, my attorney began the arduous process of pulling decades of county records, original plats, and development filings. Anything that predated the existence of the subdivision. The records that came back weren't chaotic, but they weren't clean either. They were thin, as if just enough documentation had been removed to allow the official story to proceed without resistance. When the surveyor finally came out to the property, he brought more than just his equipment. He brought photocopies of old documents, yellowed, slightly crooked, and stamped by county offices that no longer existed. He walked the land slowly, methodically, stopping at trees I recognized and stones my grandfather had set by hand. He didn't say much. He measured. He compared his old documents to the new reality. He frowned. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. This land was never sold. I asked him to repeat himself. He did. According to the original public records, the Homeowners Association had never actually purchased the property. What the original development company had secured decades earlier was a temporary development lease, a limited right to build under a specific set of conditions for a finite period. That lease had an expiration date that had come and gone years ago. I sat there, staring at the document, my finger tracing the line where a renewal signature should have been. The space was blank. To renew it, the surveyor explained, they would have needed the consent of the legal heir. Me. They never asked. They couldn't have. My attorney leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. That means, he said, his voice low, they don't own the land. They never did. The word he used next was the one that stuck. Squatting. Not confused. Not mistaken. Squatting. Suddenly, everything that had happened, the letters, the surveys, the relentless pressure, made perfect sense. If they ever acknowledged that the lease had expired, their entire structure would collapse. Every home, every permit, every bank loan was tied to ground they no longer had any legal right to occupy. So, they did what systems do when the truth is inconvenient. They buried it. We kept digging. The investigator came back with timelines, names, and a complex web of corporate shells that had been dissolved and reformed just in time to shift liability. He found development entities that had existed only long enough to pass paper from one hand to another. And right at the center of it all, always just close enough to touch but never quite in the open, was a single, recurring name, the HOA president. Back then, she wasn't a president. She was a junior attorney working with the original development firm. Her name appeared on internal memos, on early planning filings, and on correspondence that discussed lease continuity in language that artfully danced around the issue of expiration dates. One email, dated years after the lease had lapsed, made my attorney go silent. If we proceed as planned, it read, any future ownership challenges will be rendered moot by scale. Scale. Enough houses, enough families, enough forward momentum. No court, they gambled, would dare to tear that down. They hadn't been careless. They had been patient. I thought back to her house on the hill, her unshakable confidence, the way she spoke of progress, as if it were an impenetrable shield. I understood now that she hadn't just inherited power in that community. She had built it from the ground up, on land she knew from the very beginning wasn't hers. The surveyor gathered his papers and looked at me across the hood of his truck. Land doesn't forget, he said quietly. People try to make it. As he drove away, I stood there for a long time. The woods were silent. Their stakes were wrong, but the ground beneath them was the same ground my grandfather had walked. For the first time since this ordeal began, the suffocating pressure I had been carrying began to shift. It was not because the fight was over, but because I finally understood what the fight was truly about. They weren't defending a neighborhood. They were protecting a lie. And lies of that magnitude don't fall apart from the outside. They collapse when someone is willing to pull on the right thread. I went home that night and instructed my attorney to stop preparing for any form of negotiation. We're not asking them to explain, I said. We're proving they never had the right to be here in the first place. He nodded once. That was the moment the case stopped being defensive. From that point on, everything we did was about exposure. Because when you discover that an entire community is standing on borrowed ground, the only question left is how long it will take for gravity to do the rest. If the expired lease was the how, the next discovery was the how they got away with it. Banks don't lend hundreds of millions of dollars on faith, not for real estate, and certainly not at that scale. Anyone who has ever signed a mortgage understands there's a process. Title searches, insurance policies, verifications, layers of protection meant to safeguard everyone involved. That was the piece that had bothered me. Hundreds of homes don't get built on shaky ground unless someone, somewhere, officially signs off on it. My attorney called it the missing lock on the door. We went looking for it. The breakthrough came from the title insurance industry. Not from the banks directly, but from the companies that guaranteed clear ownership for them. Every single mortgage in that subdivision was backed by a title insurance policy. On paper, this meant one thing. A licensed entity had certified that the land was free and clear. It wasn't. Our investigator delved into archived underwriting files, old correspondence, and internal approval chains. What he unearthed made my stomach turn, not because it was sloppy, but because it was so precise. Years earlier, at a time when the original development lease had already expired, a formal legal opinion had been issued declaring the land free of encumbrance. This opinion had effectively overridden concerns raised by junior underwriters who had flagged inconsistencies in the chain of title. The author of that legal opinion was a familiar name, the HOA president. Back then, she wasn't living on the Hill. She was a young attorney contracted to consult on land use issues. Her name was on a document titled Title Clearance Memorandum. It was written in confident, impenetrable language, dense with legal citations, and carefully structured to sound definitive. It was also a work of fiction. She hadn't proven ownership. She had reframed its absence as authority. Where signatures were missing, she referenced constructive continuity. Where leases had expired, she cited practical reliance. Every gap in the record was filled with a dense fog of legal jargon. And it worked. The title insurance company issued coverage. The banks followed suit. Loans were approved. Foundations were poured. Hundreds of families signed 30-year notes, believing the system had performed its due diligence. In reality, the land had been laundered, not through violence or secrecy, but through paperwork. My attorney leaned back in his chair after reading the full report and said something I will never forget. "This isn't negligence," he said. "This is enterprise fraud." That phrase carried immense weight. It implied intent, coordination, a long-term plan that operated on the assumption that if the development grew large enough, no one would ever dare to unwind it. And for a very long time, they had been right. When confronted, the title insurance company didn't deny the document's existence. They denied knowing it was fraudulent. They pointed to their reliance on licensed counsel, on certifications, on trust. Trust, it turned out, had been exceptionally profitable. When the banks finally entered the conversation, they arrived with a mixture of concern and pressure. They wanted reassurance, stability, a path forward that didn't involve acknowledging the extent of their exposure. I listened. Then I showed them the opinion memo. I showed them the expired lease. I showed them the email that tied the attorney who had cleared the title to the very same person now running the HOA that claimed ownership. The room went quiet. Suddenly, this was not about one stubborn landowner refusing to cooperate. It was about hundreds of active mortgages secured by land that had never legally been transferred. One banker asked what my intentions were. I told him the truth. "I'm establishing ownership," I said. "What happens to your loans after that is between you and your legal teams." He didn't like that answer, but he understood it perfectly. When the meeting concluded, I sat alone in my truck for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. I wasn't shaking, I wasn't angry. I was just absorbing the sheer scale of what had been done. This wasn't a mistake that had spiraled out of control. This was a structure designed from the beginning to stand only as long as no one looked too closely at its foundation. The HOA president hadn't just moved into the best house on my land. She had positioned herself at the very center of a system that thrived on certainty and punished doubt. Every letter she had sent me, every survey stake she had placed, every threat of enforcement, it all rested on a single assumption: that I would blink first, that I would sell, that I would settle, that I would decide it was easier to let a lie stand than to force the truth into the light. But once I saw how the land had been laundered, how banks, insurers, and homeowners had all been drawn into the same false narrative, I knew something she didn't. Systems like that don't collapse when you shout at them. They collapse when you document them. And we now had the documents. The next step wasn't confrontation. It was exposure. Because when you can prove that an entire neighborhood was built on a forged certainty, the question isn't whether the truth will surface. It's who will still be standing when it does. Courtrooms have a distinct smell: old paper, polished wood, and the faint aroma of burnt coffee drifting from somewhere down the hall. The atmosphere isn't dramatic, it's bureaucratic. And that is what makes the moments within them so perilous. Because when something finally breaks, it breaks quietly. We didn't rush into a hearing. My attorney filed first, a clean, precise petition to establish title and quiet all competing claims. There were no grand speeches, No sweeping accusations, just a presentation of facts that demanded a response. The response came swiftly. The HOA arrived with a team of 2 lawyers in impeccably tailored suits, their binders stacked on the table like defensive armor. The president sat directly behind them, her posture composed, legs crossed, chin held high. She was dressed in navy blue, with a small gold pin on her lapel. From where I sat, she looked exactly like someone who had come expecting to win. The judge entered without ceremony. He was older, with a measured demeanor, the kind of man who had presided over enough bad arguments to recognize a good one before it had finished clearing its throat. The proceedings began. My attorney didn't open with emotion. He opened with dates. He calmly walked the court through the original lease, its scope, its limitations, and its definitive expiration. He showed the court the gap where a renewal should have been. He showed the absence of my signature. He showed the quiet, almost invisible handoff of assets from one corporate entity to another, timed just right to keep the paper moving and the questions at bay. Then, he laid the title insurance opinion on the evidence table. He didn't do it theatrically. He just placed it there and let it sit. The HOA's counsel objected immediately. Hearsay, interpretation, relevance. The judge overruled him without raising his voice. "Let's see it," he said. The document was projected onto a large screen. It was a wall of dense paragraphs, confident language, and legal citations that looked reassuring to anyone not trained to question them. My attorney pointed to the signature block, where the HOA president's name was clearly visible. The judge read the document in silence. He didn't rush. He didn't interrupt. He read the original lease again. He compared the dates. He flipped back a page, then another. The room grew profoundly still. I could hear someone shifting in their seat, the faint buzz of the projector fan, and my own breathing, which was slower than I had expected. Finally, the judge removed his glasses. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked directly at the HOA's lead counsel. "Counselor," he said, his voice even, "are you aware that your client's entire subdivision is technically trespassing?" The word hung in the air. Trespassing. Not non-compliant. Not disputed. Trespassing. The attorney opened his mouth, then closed it. He tried again, attempting to pivot toward arguments about reliance, community harm, and economic impact. The judge simply raised a hand. "Answer the question." The attorney glanced back at the HOA president. She was no longer smiling. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was not aware." The judge nodded once. "That's a problem," he said. He turned his attention back to the documents, to the lease, to the opinion memo, to the timeline that no longer made sense if you read it slowly instead of accepting it as a whole. "The court finds," he continued, "that there is a substantial likelihood the plaintiff holds superior title to the land in question." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge went on. "Accordingly, all enforcement actions initiated by the Homeowners Association are hereby stayed. Further, the association is enjoined from representing itself as a lawful authority over the property, pending final adjudication." He paused, then added a line that felt like a hammer blow. "And I am referring the matter of the title insurance certification to the appropriate regulatory and criminal authorities." The HOA president's face changed then. It was no longer anger or fear. It was calculation. The hearing was adjourned early. Outside the courtroom, the hallway erupted in a cacophony of voices. Lawyers spoke quickly into their phones, and people began to realize that this situation was not going to be resolved quietly. Reporters appeared as if summoned by instinct, armed with cameras and questions. I didn't stop. I walked past them all, out into the daylight, and stood for a moment on the courthouse steps. My attorney joined me, exhaling as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. "That went better than expected," he said. I nodded, but I wasn't celebrating. Winning a motion is not the same as winning a war. What the judge had done was crack the foundation. He hadn't torn anything down yet, but he had confirmed something essential. The story the HOA had told for years, the story that banks believed, homeowners relied on, and authorities avoided questioning, no longer held. Back inside, the HOA's lawyers were already pivoting, talking about settlements, mitigating harm, and finding a path forward. The president didn't join them. She stood alone for a moment near the wall, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent. When she noticed me watching, she didn't look away. She stared back. For the first time since this began, her expression held no confidence, no assumption that momentum would save her. There was only the stark realization that the ground beneath her, literal and otherwise, had irrevocably shifted. That night, I went home and walked to the edge of the property again. The same trees, the same stones, the same profound quiet. Nothing looked different, but everything was. Because the court hadn't just acknowledged my claim, it had exposed theirs. And once a judge says the word trespassing out loud, you can't just put it back in the file. You can only deal with what comes next. For them, that meant scrutiny. For the banks, it meant panic. For the homeowners, it meant a terrifying uncertainty. And for me, it meant something else entirely. Leverage. The kind that doesn't need to shout. The kind that can afford to wait. Because when an entire community learns it's standing on borrowed ground, the real question isn't who owns the land. It's who decides what happens to everyone living on it. The ruling changed everything and nothing all at once. On paper, the HOA's authority was frozen. The incessant letters stopped. The security patrols vanished. The main gate remained open. But when you strip away a system that has been pretending to be solid for years, what is left behind isn't peace. It's a profound and unsettling confusion. A few evenings later, I drove through the neighborhood slowly with my windows down. Children were riding their bikes in the street. Porch lights began to click on as the sun dipped behind the hills. A man watering his lawn waved at me without knowing who I was. A woman walked her dog past a community sign that still bore the HOA logo, which now looked less like a symbol of authority and more like a prop from a play that had ended abruptly. These weren't invaders. They were families. People who had signed legal documents, shaken hands with real estate agents, and trusted that the banks, insurers, and inspectors had done the jobs they were told had already been done. There were people who thought they were buying stability and had instead inherited an uncertainty they never asked for. Word spread quickly once the court filings became public record. Some homeowners began showing up at my gate, folders clutched in their hands, containing mortgage statements, purchase agreements, and nervous-sounding letters from their banks. They weren't angry, at least not at first. They were scared. One couple sat across from me at my kitchen table and explained how they had poured their life savings into their down payment. Another man told me he had moved his elderly parents in with him after his wife passed away, believing the community would be quiet and safe for them. A woman apologized before she had even finished introducing herself, saying she had never supported the HOA board's actions but had felt powerless to speak up. "We didn't know," she said, her voice trembling. "We just believed what we were told." I believed her. Not everyone came with such humility. A few arrived defensively, demanding reassurance and asking what I planned to do with their homes. One man raised his voice, accusing me of trying to profit from other people's misfortune. I listened patiently. Then I asked him a simple question. "Did you ever support the letters they sent me?" I asked. The fines, the threats, the pressure. He didn't answer. That became the dividing line. I refused to lump everyone together. I would not punish an entire community for the sins of a corrupt board. But I also refused to pretend that choices hadn't been made along the way. Who had spoken up? Who had remained silent? Who had actively helped to apply the pressure when it suited them? At night, after my own house had gone quiet, I would walk the perimeter of the property again. I looked at the lights twinkling in the distance, each one marking a family, now trying to make sense of what had happened to their foundation of security. I thought about my grandfather's words. That land asked for respect and patience, nothing more. The court had handed me leverage. What I chose to do with it would define everything that followed. I consulted with my attorney, with economists, and with urban planners who understood long-term land use far better than short-term revenge. The easy path, the legal path, would have been mass eviction. The emotional path was certainly tempted by it. But the truth, I realized, sat somewhere else entirely. If my goal was to end the damage caused by a system built on deception, I couldn't simply replace it with another one driven by impulse. I needed a solution that held the guilty accountable without destroying the lives of those who had not acted in bad faith. That realization did not come with a sense of relief. It came with a profound sense of weight. Because when you're the one holding the deed, the hardest part isn't proving you are right. It's deciding how right you are willing to be. The next steps would not be taken in a courtroom. They would be taken across kitchen tables, in quiet conversations with people who had never in their lives expected to meet the actual owner of the ground beneath their feet. And whatever decision I made next would echo for far longer than any judge's ruling. Because justice, once you finally reach it, doesn't end the story. It hands you responsibility. And responsibility, I was learning, is heavier than any stack of legal binders I had carried so far. Power doesn't need to announce itself. Once the court froze the HOA's authority, everyone, by default, started looking at me. Not because I wanted them to, but because there was simply nowhere else to look. The board went silent. Their lawyers stopped returning calls. The entire structure that had dictated people's lives for years had simply vanished, leaving a vacuum in its place. I did not fill that vacuum with grand speeches or online declarations. I didn't stand at the gate explaining myself to passersby. Instead, I put something in writing, something clear, simple, and impossible to misinterpret. A framework. Every homeowner received the same notice. It contained no threats and no legal jargon designed to intimidate. It just stated the facts. The land was mine. The HOA no longer had jurisdiction. No one was being evicted without cause. But from that moment forward, occupancy would be governed by lawful agreements, or it would not be governed at all. I offered long-term ground leases, 25 to 40 years, with fixed terms and transparent conditions. There were no behavioral rules, no aesthetic controls, no committees telling people how tall their grass could be or what color their front door should be. There were only basic land use covenants. If you paid your lease and respected your neighbors, you stayed. That was it. For some, the relief was palpable. You could see in their faces when they realized no one was ever again going to measure their fence height or send them a warning letter because their trash cans were visible from the street. Others were suspicious. They had lived under the thumb of arbitrary authority for so long that they didn't know how to trust its absence. And then there were the few who did not qualify. Former board members, the ones whose signatures were on the enforcement letters, the ones whose names appeared repeatedly in the complaint logs and on the camera footage, the ones who had actively helped turn bureaucratic pressure into a personal weapon. Their applications for leases were denied. Not out of anger, but based on the record. I didn't argue with them or justify my decision. I simply pointed to their documented behavior and explained that trust, once so thoroughly broken, is not owed a second chance by default. The banks came next. They wanted meetings, reassurances, and proposals that would allow them to pretend the last decade hadn't happened. They spoke of market confidence and the importance of stability. I listened. Then I told them the truth. You didn't verify ownership, I said. You relied on a fraudulent title clearance because it was insured. That is not my emergency. That is a failure of your due diligence. The room went quiet. They didn't like it, but they understood it. With lawful leases in place, something unexpected began to happen. Appraisals, which had been in free fall, stabilized, and then began to improve. Properties that had been tangled in a web of legal uncertainty now sat on clearly defined, legally managed land. There was no hidden authority, no threat of arbitrary fines, no intimidating letters tucked into mailboxes. Security had returned, not the kind enforced by patrols and penalties, but the kind that comes from clarity. One homeowner told me it was the first time she felt like she actually owned her life there, even if she no longer owned the soil. That stayed with me. I hadn't dismantled the community. I had dismantled the lie. And in its place, I had put something quieter, something boring, something true. It didn't make everyone happy. It wasn't supposed to, but it stopped the bleeding. It gave people something solid to stand on, which was more than the HOA had ever provided. By the time the final court date approached, the outcome felt inevitable. The legal arguments had been exhausted. The documents spoke for themselves. The only thing left was accountability, and accountability unlike authority, doesn't negotiate. It arrives, usually late, but always exact. The end did not come with applause. It came with paperwork. The final ruling was clear and unambiguous. The HOA was dissolved, its authority voided retroactively. The land, every single acre of it, was confirmed as mine. The fraud that had held the entire structure together was no longer a rumor whispered in hallways. It was an official finding of the court. Assets were seized. The HOA president's house on the hill went first, then the bank accounts, then the consulting firm she had used to funnel fees and favors under a dozen different names. What she had spent years collecting quietly and confidently was taken back in the exact same way, quietly on paper. The court ordered restitution. The funds recovered from the seizure were set aside for the homeowners who had been misled, the people who had bought in good faith and paid for a certainty they were never actually given. It didn't make them whole. Nothing ever does. But it was an acknowledgement of the truth. She lost everything in the same way she had tried to take mine, without asking and without permission. With the HOA gone and lawful leases in place, something else happened. Something I hadn't planned for but welcomed. Property values rose. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. The appraisers returned. Banks resumed lending. Buyers stopped asking about risk and started asking about terms. For the first time, the land was being managed honestly. Families stopped worrying about whether a misplaced mailbox would cost them a month's mortgage. They planted trees. They painted their porches. They lived. One evening, a neighbor I barely knew stopped me near the old gate. He had lived there for years, kept his head down, and paid his dues. "Funny thing," he said, "my place is worth more now than it ever was under the HOA." I nodded. When ownership is clear, I told him, value tends to follow. The signs came down next. The old HOA logos, bold, official, and now utterly meaningless, were removed one by one. In their place, I had a single, simple sign installed near the entrance. It wasn't flashy. It didn't make threats. It just said, private land. No HOA. People took pictures of it. Some smiled. A few shook their heads. Life moved on. I still walked the property. I still stop at the stones my grandfather set and the trees he marked by hand. The neighborhood looks different now. More lived in, less managed, less afraid. I don't pretend that everyone sees me as a hero. Some never will. Some lost more than they gained. That is also the truth, and it matters. But justice doesn't mean no one gets hurt. It means the right people stopped getting away with it. When the dust finally settled, I stood on the hill that used to overlook a system built on intimidation and a certainty borrowed from lies. The ground felt the same beneath my boots, solid, patient. Land doesn't ask for much, just respect. And when you give it that, when you refuse to let it be used as leverage by people who mistake control for ownership, it has a way of setting things right, slowly, firmly, and without asking permission. That is what happened here. It wasn't a victory lap. It was a correction. And for the first time since that gate had closed in front of my truck, I wasn't standing on borrowed ground. I was standing where my family had always stood, on what was rightfully ours.